so important question, Xbox or PlayStation? And I just went, PC. And they're like, oh, because one of them was PC, one of them was Xbox, one of them was PlayStation. So they're like, cool, we have a deciding vote. And I went for PC and they were very impressed. My nerd cred just went through the roof.
All right. Let's take the conversation down just a notch. There was absolutely $0 in the budget for PC gaming. There was nothing in there to promote esports in Australia, although there should have been. Yes. Absolutely zero support for one of the fastest growing sporting franchises in the world, which is esports. Mm-hmm. Nothing. Not a penny.
Rubbish. Hello and welcome to Keep the Bastards Honest, the podcast of the Australian Democrats. I'm your host, Elana Mitchell, and on this episode, it's budget time. Before you recoil in horror and switch off the episode, you don't need to be a budget nerd to enjoy this one, mainly because this year's budget was oh so political, oh so short-term, and frankly, such a crushing disappointment, even the coalition's cheer squad in the Murdoch papers felt compelled to point out how instantly forgettable it was. Despite that, there's a lot to unpack about how this government sees its role and its responsibility to society, and how that shapes our lives. For this one, Steve and I were joined by young Democrat Rhiannon Kernot, who scrutinised the budget on behalf of her generation, and unsurprisingly for this government, found it wanting. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this post-mortem of the last budget of the 46th Parliament of Australia. Rhiannon, Steve and I pay our respects to the traditional owners of the land upon which we met and their elders past and present. Sovereignty never ceded. So, budget 2022. We've got the band back together to talk budget stuff because we're all nerds. We acknowledge it straight up. We're not ashamed. We fly our nerd flags proud.
Badge of honour.
Yeah. And this one's, I don't know how to begin to describe this one. This one is a very strange budget. Like last year, I felt like we went through the budget quite forensically and ripped it apart and called out the government on all of the ways in which they fudged the figures. And despite the 2021 budget allegedly being a women's budget, we sort of pulled it all apart and went, actually, it does jack for women. This budget is very different based. What did you what were your initial thoughts when you watched it get handed down?
This budget was in its entirety a grab bag of vote buying, to put it in a nutshell. Last year's budget had this vague sort of sense that it was trying to do something. It had some money for aged care, which seemed aligned with the Royal Commission recommendations. It wasn't as much funding as was recommended, but at least there was some there. There was some money for women's programs. A lot of what was indicated for women was actually more broad than that and not really for women, but there was, there was money there. There was some semblance of structure to it, some semblance of a plan to it. That's all gone in 2022. This last budget has no coherence to it. It has no sense of being anything other than an unashamedly vote-buying exercise.
I think in the most bizarre way, though, it's that they've cherry-picked these random groups of people that I suppose they believe are going to be their voters. It's not a converting budget in the way that we saw kind of last year, where we were kind of had there was quite a strong debate around whether it was this Labor budget, the social budget of it. Whereas this year we're not seeing that. We're seeing that this is targeted for Liberal voters ultimately, or at least where I would be interpreting that they see their vote basis being, but it doesn't do a lot.
No. I mean, it is a really cynical vote-buying exercise, and it's really revealing as to who they think they can convince to vote for them. And
Yes.
I would go out on a limb and say anybody under the age of 30 is not in that bracket.
Unless
Yeah.
you do a trade,
Mm.
and then you may be within that bracket.
There's a lot in there for tradies, and when you sort of look across the spread, there is quite a bit in there for for those high earning tradies, and a lot of trades are paying very well at the moment. They're in very high demand. Their services are in demand, and the labour is in high demand. And so tradies are pushing into the highest income tax bracket. Their fuel excise will help them disproportionately. Like a fuel excise cut of 22 cents per litre for the next 6 months will help people driving around those large utes and those large SUVs, those subsidised trade vehicles that we see, the Mercedes ute that you see showing up on construction sites these days, which I still can't wrap my head around, but more power to them. And then the apprenticeship program, which sees, I think, $15,000 a year subsidised on the salary of an apprentice, saving on the expenditure of those same tradies when they hire junior workers. So there's a lot in there. Similarly, a lot of them will be small businesses, so they'll be able to claim $1.20 for every dollar that they spend on training, up to I think $100,000 a year. Like these are all things that will help that group. But that group has been shifting towards the Liberal Party for the last decade, and I'm not sure they really needed help solidifying their vote, but they got it.
Yeah, because and it's interesting because the whole tradies thing 2 decades ago were traditional not liberal, Labor voters, and then they became Howard's battlers, and now they're sort of Morrison's best friends. And I think Catherine Murphy had a really great article a few months ago about the people who will vote for Morrison, and they are young men at risk of voting for Labor. And that budget makes it like it's in neon lights exactly how badly Morrison wants to reassure those people that they need to stick with him.
It plays into the other aspect of Scott Morrison's sort of public persona as well, though. The guy who goes to the footy, who follows the Sharks, who just wants to support his footy team, who'll have a beer and a pie at the game, just an ordinary guy from
Dad next door.
yeah, like that guy wants to connect with that group. The thing is, though, as I say, I think that job was done. I think they're reasonably firmly sold if they were going to be sold. And the rest of it seems really ill-conceived. Let's put it in those sorts of terms. And even more than last year's budget will fail to deliver any kind of lasting impact. And not least because there's an election coming in 6 or 7 weeks' time and they're likely to lose and their budget's likely to be meaningless anyway. But even were it to be enacted, so if you look at it as a plan for the future of the country and a vision for our priorities and all the rest of it, there's just nothing long-term in it.
No, it's literally a vision for the next 6 or 7 weeks. Crikey, Bernard Keane from Crikey said this budget becomes, regardless of who wins the election, this budget becomes irrelevant 6 p.m. on election night. And Greg Jericho from The Guardian said the budget was one of those really interesting or sort of bizarre phenomenons where the budget was literally forgotten about 30 seconds after Josh Frydenberg got done delivering it.
It was so quiet this year for the budget. From my perspective, yeah, if you are switched into the news and everything, last year with the budget, I felt that I was bombarded with it's a women's budget, it's a Labor's budget, it's this, there were so many comments on how we're recovering from COVID and this, and I got so much information around it. And this year it was like crickets immediately after it kind of happened. I literally mentioned it to somebody else, actually I was saying I was doing this and they went, oh, I didn't even realize that came out this week. I went, oh, we're on kind of different wavelengths, but it was just not something relevant other than I think the fuel excise, because everybody I know has been going, oh my God, the cost of fuel. I was quite excited yesterday. I bought fuel. It was $1.77. I never thought I would say that was an exciting thing, but it really was. Apparently one of my local Local ones were selling for $1.54, which I don't know how they're even doing that yet, but it was very exciting. But to me, that's the biggest thing that's kind of come out of this. Everything else, there was the changes to the parental leave, which, for some parents, that's going to be a significant thing. I actually think for yourself, Steve, as a father, that's probably a more significant change. But otherwise, maybe the defense was the only other really big section. And that one's like, well, we've kind of got this war going up. It's like, well, yes, we've got defense investment. Okay. It just was this very quiet, here's the budget. And what's surprising about that is it's a confusing attitude in the lead up to an election, where your budget could have been that thing that does convince new voters, but it doesn't even seem to have done that. It's this very, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And the budget was framed by the media as the government's last chance to sort of save itself in the lead up to the election and sort of save its political fortunes. And you would think that it would be the big vision, big nation, not even nation building, but the illusion of having a nation building vision for the country that they want to spur and as you said, convince people to stick with them. And they sort of script it. It's incoherent. It's a bit of a mess. There's no sort of overarching narrative beyond Labor can't be trusted on anything, which is standard boilerplate for the coalition. And this, as you said, Rhiannon, this sort of khaki election that they've been desperately trying to manufacture. I mean, Peter Dutton must have gotten down on his knees in gratitude when Putin invaded Ukraine and actually started a war, because all of a sudden he actually has an actual real life war to bang the defense drum on, as opposed to trying to manufacture one with China.
He really does. The ability to point to the conflict in Ukraine, the aggression of Russia, the uncertain global conditions that come from that did a lot for the coalition. And I don't want to make light of the fact that it's not doing good things for Ukraine. It's a serious issue. People are getting hurt. Cities are being destroyed. Infrastructure is being destroyed, and it will take decades to rebuild that country once this thing is over. From a political point of view locally, Peter Dutton would have been extremely, extremely pleased, as you say, to not have to try and manufacture a conflict with China or raise a shimmer of a conflict with China, but instead could point to a real conflict and real consequences. And then they've spent the last 5 weeks trying to sort of stretch that bow as far as they can to indicate that, well, look at what's happening to the disruption in gas supply in Europe. We don't want to see that at home. So we should absolutely invest in more gas extraction in Australia to shore up our local reserves. Otherwise, gas shock like we've seen in Europe. That kind of thing has absolutely taken front of stage. That overall narrative for me in this budget came through. You could see it sort of each time Josh Frydenberg introduced a new area of the budget, whether it was on health spending or defence or whatever it might be. There's this idea that at some point in the past, the government put in place a plan. That's arguable, but there was this sort of narrative that we put in place that plan is working, also arguable, and here's what we're going to do to continue on that plan. And therefore, the implicit part is that don't interrupt the plan, and we should be given more time to continue with our plan rather than it being stopped midstream and handed off to Labor. Now, none of that rings true. Like the idea that there's some national plan would come as a surprise to a lot of Australians because there's no real evidence of it, unless that plan is to try and divert public money into private hands and concentrate it into as fewer hands as possible. If that's the plan, then fair enough. That one's fairly obvious. But aside from that, there is no vision for Australia as, like a future better place. There is no sense of what we want this country to become and the opportunity for it and the potential of it as it appears in the budget papers. There's no sense of that. And the idea that there is a plan, that it's working, for whom is questionable, and that therefore we shouldn't interrupt it, seem to be the only part of the budget that was coherent at all. The rest of it seemed to be, and here's a little bit for you, and here's a little bit for you, and here's a little bit for you. And I think, Rhiannon, to your point around, it didn't seem to make a big splash. Normally in the budget we get this, and who are the winners and who are the losers and who came out ahead and who's gone backwards. And there weren't really any losers because it was deliberately not set up that way. It was deliberately set up so that everyone's a winner because there's an election that's going to be announced in, 3 or 10 days or so.
And I remember the budget last year, because it had to be the women's budget because Morrison's standing with women had collapsed so dramatically last year. And, we put the lie to it being a women's budget last year. But even for, shall we call them, women's stuff, a lot of the stuff that was actually put into that budget last year hasn't actually come into effect yet. In this, it's not even in this budget, but in this year, 2022, a lot of those measures still haven't actually started.
No.
And in the women's budget statement, which to their credit they have reintroduced after Tony Abbott scrapped it, as you said, it's that narrative of, well, this is the strong plan we have for keeping women safe and securing their economic future and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, yeah, but you're still not doing any of it. Yeah, the pittance out of a $625 billion budget, they're tossing a couple of $100 million here and a couple of $100 million there on things, and for measures that haven't even begun from last year yet. And so we're still, in terms of actual outcomes and boots on ground, doing stuff on women's safety, domestic violence, trying to lift women's economic participation. They literally haven't even started anything yet. It's bizarre.
You're still seeing the same levels of domestic violence. You're still seeing the same levels of murder by intimate partners, and that is predominantly violence against women by men. You're still seeing the same levels of gender pay inequity. You're still seeing the same issues around retirement incomes. Women over 50 are still the fastest growing homeless cohort, or people experiencing homelessness. Women over 50 remain the fastest growing cohort. Like any of the things that you would look to and say, well, how successful was last year's budget in addressing those issues? And unfortunately, we're still sitting here 12 months later going, still waiting. It's exactly right. We're still waiting. And the money that we're seeing this year is actually less than last year.
Of course it is.
We did actually know that was going to happen. One of the kind of key things from last year was a lot of them were like, after this happens, we'll begin funding in this, or we'll there's this little initial bit for 2 years, and then we intend on doing this afterwards. But there's a lot of that stuff was very much delayed. And I think in this year's budget, a lot of it is it is short focus. This is what we're doing for the next year. There's those couple of, longer term infrastructure development kind of things, which I think was their only attempt at any sort of climate change response.
Yeah, we'll come to that.
Yeah, that's a whole nother elephant in the room, but it was very much a temporary budget.
Look, I will give them credit for one thing. The one thing they did do for women that it's not necessarily like that there's a sliver of good in that they so previously women got 18 weeks of paid parental leave and men got 2 weeks of paid parental leave, and with a use it or lose it sort of catch to it. And what they've done, they've sort of combined that together into 20 weeks of leave, which the family can choose to use as they see fit. And if you're a single parent, you now get 20 weeks of leave, which is great. That is the one good thing for single parents. For couples, it's actually a backward step, because removing the use it or lose it clause on that 2 weeks of parental leave for what I'm going to call the secondary caregiver, so as to pull gender out of it, means that it's most likely that the primary caregiver will take the full 20 weeks of leave.
That's right.
And that is actually an incredibly regressive step, because there's sort of studies from across like 28 countries around the world have proven that you need to put a use it or lose it portion of time into the start of a young family's life to ensure that both parents are active and engaged as parents. And that sets up that family to have an active, and, I'm going to bring gender back into it, to have an active and engaged dad parenting their kids going forward, because if you don't force dads out of the workforce for a couple of weeks or a month when their child is born to bond with that child, engage with that child, become a parent, everything falls to primarily the mother and the dad just goes back to work. And we fall into this archaic breadwinner versus caregiver dynamic in that family for the next 20 years.
And I think the logistical setup is that if you have paid leave for 20 weeks instead, across your family, you're going to have that, you want to take that 20 weeks. But really what doesn't happen then is that secondary caregiver, or even if you divvy it up, if you go 10 weeks and 10 weeks, chances are you're not going to have those double up at a point, because then you actually lose extra time that you could have had that the baby at home, I suppose, Whereas now, yeah, it is going to be either just one person doing it, or you don't actually have that relationship within the family unit, because it's trying to extend the time frame in which you can use the parental leave.
Yeah. What they should have done was given both parents 20 weeks to use as they see fit, and if they don't use it, they lose it, whether you be the primary caregiver or the secondary caregiver. And so you'd end up with hypothetically 40 weeks of leave that you can mix and match and balance out. And, but each of you has to take 20 weeks.
Yeah. And look, 40 weeks of paid parental leave is a lot more than what we currently provide, which is the 18 plus 2 and now sort of 20 combined. It's still less than a lot of countries in the OECD. It's still not a lot. It's more than some places, but it would still not be considered excessive in Scandinavian countries, for example, where they get 52 weeks of paid parental leave. There's a few other things that happen as a result. So one of the changes that the superannuation industry were pushing for, and I know REST was one of them, and I saw a statement from them on Wednesday. But this idea that paid parental leave attracts superannuation was put forward as a way of helping close that gap in retirement positions for women in particular. That didn't happen. So we're perpetuating that gap. And I think working women who've had children are something like 30 or 35% worse off in terms of their average retirement incomes or their superannuation balance at retirement than men. And men with similar qualifications and this kind of thing. That's one aspect of it. And that part of it was disappointing that we didn't get that part pushed through. The other side of it, though, is that we have this expectation in Australian society, and you mentioned it before, that we've got sort of a breadwinner and a caregiver. The caregiver tends to be female or a woman. They do tend to be gendered roles in Australia, and we accept that as being normal, even though it's not. It's absolutely a social construct. And we had the opportunity in tinkering with the paid parental leave scheme to try and break that societal norm. We had the opportunity to say it's going to be 20 weeks, but it has to be evenly split. So men need to take, or the father or the secondary caregiver need to take half of it, and the other half of it goes to the primary caregiver. That's the way that it's going to be. And what that does is it sends a message that both parents, when there are two parents, they are equal partners in raising children, that their role is not gendered, that there is an expectation that they do be able to feed a baby, that they do be able to change their nappies, that they do be able to comfort them when they're distressed and change their clothes and bathe them and all of those sorts of things, that's part of what being a parent is. And it's not naturally a woman's role, and it's not naturally a man's role to go to the workplace. And that could have been addressed. It's one of the things that you see in those Scandinavian countries that have those rules in place, places like Norway and Denmark, where you need to take at least 3 months of leave as the secondary parent. Those norms that say it's acceptable for a woman to leave the office early when their child's sick, but it would be frowned upon if a man did it. And that absolutely happens. A father in the workplace who says, I need to go home early today because the school called and my child's sick, would be looked upon as, that's kind of weird. Why isn't your wife doing that? Because we accept those societal norms. So in terms of like a budget being used as a tool to frame society and to set us up to be the type of country that we want to be, that was a missed opportunity. That was something that we could have done, that a lot of people would like to see done, and that we didn't do, unfortunately.
And I want us to stress to people that we're not sort of being socially, like, we're not trying to social engineer this, socialist utopia sort of thing. These are norms that are already prevalent in society, and it's simply government catching up to them. And I'll use an example from my work. One of my teammates was saying that he had to work from home for a week because his wife was away and he was babysitting. And before any of the women on the team had an opportunity to say anything, the men on the team, it was very, it was friendly and polite, and we made it in a joking way, but the men in the team ripped into him and went, dude, it's not babysitting when it's your kid. You are parenting.
That language that is still used, I think, is indicative of these broader social norms that we're getting. And unfortunately, whilst I do think this is one step towards it, that there is an opportunity now for a more equitable distribution of leave for a primary and a secondary caregiver. I think there's an opportunity there, and I don't want to detract from that is one step. Is it the best step that could have been made? No. But what we still do see is this very much a language of it's men as this particularly men, that they are a secondary caregiver, that they are babysitting, they are filling in for the role of the wife, but it is coming back to setting up those relationships from first and foremost, where you're not just coming in while the wife can go have a shower in the night. No, I'm home to now care for my child alongside you. It's great that in that situation that you do have men standing up and challenging a lot of those notions, and that is fantastic to hear. But ultimately, that's still the attitude.
Hopefully you'd see an end to the response to that scenario, Rhiannon, of the guy coming home from work and beginning to take care of their child. that language that people would object to that and go, but he's been working all day.
Yeah.
As though the wife hasn't, right? Like as though being at home, being a carer is not work.
Absolutely. And I think, look, I am seeing it within my generation. There are kind of these shifts in it. My cousins went and took, him and his best friend went and took their kids to a Wiggles concert together. And it was like this bro thing, though, of them like dancing with their little boys now, like taking them to the Wiggles concert. And my mum was reflecting on it, going that when I had you, I actually took my sister to the Wiggles concert, and I could not even imagine my dad or your uncle going to those concerts. It just wasn't a thing that happened. But now that is just something that is increasingly normalized, and they're filming the kids there and that sort of thing, and you can see that there is starting to be this much more equitable distribution between the role of men and women there. And so what we're seeing legislatively, to me, is actually starting to be behind where we actually are moving towards socially.
Exactly.
And so that's why this, I think, is an insufficient move, is that it's not actually even meeting where I think we are up to, but it's also not future thinking to develop further social change.
Yes. No, you nailed it. Because, look, I'm going to womansplain for a second, but I think men, and particularly, younger generations of men, are looking to be given permission to leave the workforce and be parents, take their kids to the Wiggles concert, which is awesome. I love that story. And we need to give them the legislative framework to nudge companies and to nudge that cultural change along and normalize all of that. And I think it's a reflection of how this government not just sees women, but sees men. Because let's face it, the coalition are dominated by men, and they're dominated by men who, thanks to being politicians and thanks to being in careers that require them to travel a lot and to be absent from the home a lot, their wives are essentially stay-at-home mums looking after, raising these very important families that when the political career is over, they go home to spend more time with. And it shapes, I think, the way they view the world. They look at the world, they're still in that 90s, 50s framework of, well, I'm very important and I go to Canberra and I run the country and my wife stays home and raises our children.
Yeah.
I think this is where we're getting down to the heart of what is actually a flaw in an overall parliamentary issue, particularly prevalent within the Liberal National Coalition, but I think more broadly across Parliament, is that we still appear to have this idea of there is the working but also much older generation too, that a lot of we do not have a younger voice coming through within Parliament. It is still very much a historical approach to a lot of these changing values that we are seeing more prevalent within the rest of society, that there is this kind of micro antique version of Australian society, and they're running to try and catch up with it.
Are they though? Are they trying to catch up?
It's not running. It's not running.
Are they running?
It's somebody shoved something in front of them that they went, I
Yeah.
don't agree with. Possibly we might have to do something about that, or I will have to leave this place.
Yeah.
Or
I've just had a cattle prod poke me in the backside, and I've sort of shuffled along to try and catch up.
Maybe. But I also want to pick up on that idea of the coalition's gendered view of Australian society, and you can see it in some of the other decisions that they've made. So they talk a lot about trying to drive jobs and job creation in Australia, and they point to their investment in certain industries as the way in which they're doing that. And the construction industry and their expenditure on infrastructure and transport projects is one of the areas that they point to and say, look, we're investing in infrastructure, we're investing in good, honest, blue-collar jobs, we're supporting Australian workers, and they talk about it in those terms. But the Australia Institute has sort of looked at where investment in different industries leads to jobs. And I think for each $1 million invested in construction, you get a job. It's probably for a man, and sort of 0.3 jobs for women. And that's sort of the return that you get for every $1 million invested in an infrastructure project. If you invest $1 million, though, in education, that creates 10 jobs for women and 4 jobs for men. And if what you were really trying to do was create jobs rather than photo opportunities, you'd be investing in education. Like that $1 million you would be putting into education. But it seems that because that leads to women's employment and work for people in jobs that doesn't look as good, you can't wear high vis in a university environment. You just look silly. It doesn't get the kind of investment that you would otherwise get. And so this notion of investing for jobs seems to really mean investing for men's jobs in male-dominated industries rather than really looking at, well, how would we spur jobs growth in Australia and investing in those sectors.
And also investing in the sectors that need the jobs. Like one of the things that a few commentators picked up on with this budget in particular is they're throwing billions of dollars at infrastructure investment when the construction industry is already tight as a drum. Like the demand for construction is through the roof, and it's getting to the point where state governments are actually delaying projects because they can't, the cost overruns are so high.
Yeah.
Those projects are becoming uneconomical and that they're not going to get the return on investment that they want. So they're sort of delaying them until the construction industry cools down a bit. And the federal government's coming in over the top going, here's all the infrastructure investment because we're creating jobs for men. And at the same time, because it's not just that they're not investing in education, they're ripping money out of education. I mean, the last 2 years, education was, I think, the third biggest export industry in this country. It was a net.
It was a big one.
It was huge. Like it was a huge income stream for the country. And they didn't just abandon it during the pandemic. They actively ripped it out from the roots to try and kill it. Like I said, it's not even that they're just sort of not just letting it toddle along and they're not investing in it. They're ripping investment out of it and taking and destroying jobs. I mean, every time anyone talks about, and I know we will get to climate change, but every time everyone talks about phasing out of coal, the coalition loses their minds over all the jobs we're going to lose out of the coal mining industry.
Yeah.
And it's like there's 5 times as many, we lost 5 times as many jobs out of the education industry during the pandemic than actually exist in coal at the moment.
Yeah.
But those jobs apparently didn't matter, but the high-vis ones in coal did.
Yeah, it gets worse the more you dig into those numbers. So last year, the Australia Institute did a report into where people are employed in the coal industry and the ability for people to migrate from a job in coal into a job somewhere else. And they identified maybe only 800 jobs that would be difficult to replace where that particular person and their skills would be hard to transition to another industry. Most of coal and like both mining and energy generation are engineering type jobs that are applicable to a whole range of different industries. An engineer employed in coal mining could easily shift to lithium mining, for example, or another type of mine. Power generation could easily shift to other types of power generation. Those sorts of engineering jobs are quite easily transferable. And then there's a relatively small number of specialist underground coal mining technician or technical type jobs, 600 to 800 of them only, that you would find difficult to replace. If you compare that then to the university sector, only the university sector as far as education is concerned, during the pandemic, the university sector lost 27,000 jobs. And those jobs are difficult to replace. Like, people who are employed in universities aren't easily transferable into other industries. Education is pretty much where they're at. And if they're not directly in education, then they're research scientists. And those jobs are even harder to transition into other areas, especially when the sorts of non-university R&D centres like the CSIRO are also being underfunded. So it's worse the more you look at it. And I know there was some funding allocated this year around improving our R&D capability, putting money back into scientific research in Australia, some of it in universities, some of it with the CSIRO. But all of it is targeted at specific opportunities for commercialisation of research. And anyone who works in university research and R&D more broadly will tell you that a lot of research is undertaken without a clear benefit in mind. It doesn't have clear commercial opportunities when it's first conceived, and some of it never will. Some of it is only there to help improve our understanding of the way in which the world works and to explore it as an intellectual exercise, and that has value to us as a society, not to this government though.
Yeah, and that kind of research leads to breakthroughs down the track. A lot of that research is foundational stuff that needs to be done, as you said, to expand our knowledge of how the world works and expand our knowledge of science, which then leads to commercializable breakthroughs down the track. I mean, on the last pod episode that we published with Greg Weil, we talked about the mRNA breakthrough.
Yes.
And how that literally took decades of one woman fighting, not having faith that she knew that breakthrough was there to be found, and she spent decades fighting to get it. And only after that was she able to commercialize it, and were we able to get mRNA vaccines during a global pandemic.
And it was really only when the pandemic hit that everyone went, "Oh shit, that's what we need. We need that."
Yeah. If Dr. Kariko had not spent decades finding that one particular breakthrough, we'd probably still be in lockdown, frankly. It just makes me angry.
And a lot more people did.
Yeah.
That is one of the things that they actually did end up investing in, and that Victoria hopefully going to, become the first place in the Southern Hemisphere to develop to produce the mRNA vaccine, which is nice. It's super useful coming out of it, I suppose, in case we have another pandemic sometime soon.
And we will, Rhiannon. We
will. No, it is a genuinely, it is a good investment. Could we have done it last year? Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. But in recognizing all those things, that is there.
Yeah.
At the same time, we aren't investing in the research capability to develop new things to manufacture in that mRNA facility. We're entirely reliant on other people to do the R&D, to come up with new vaccines, to come up with new medicines that we might eventually manufacture. We've cut funding and refused funding for our own research into how that technology might get used.
And let's not forget that the government was dragged kicking and screaming to mRNA vaccines as a whole in the first place. They literally put all of their baskets into the AstraZeneca traditional vaccine, which, don't get me wrong, is an excellent vaccine. Rhiannon's had it. But
I couldn't get the second one, but that aside.
Like in the height of the pandemic, when one of the limitations on that vaccine was that ideally you had to have 12 weeks between shots, whereas the mRNA vaccines was 3 weeks. And the government just, they wouldn't invest in vaccines, never mind in production of them. It's just that, and we have talked about this a lot, about just the literal short-term thinking of the government. So we spoke about this in terms of quarantine facilities on the previous podcast, and how we still don't have any. Everything with this government, they're a day late, they're $1 short, and they literally have to be dragged kicking and screaming to things that should just never have been contestable in the first place.
Should have already happened,
basically. So let's pick up on another example of that. And I want to come back to infrastructure for a minute, because I think this is a really good example of a lost opportunity. So we mentioned earlier the government has put more money into infrastructure. I think they announced $17 billion in additional spending on infrastructure. Budget papers cited $225 billion in projects underway at different levels of government across the country. We mentioned that the New South Wales government came out the day before the budget and said we're putting a hold on some projects because demand is so high, we can't find people, we can't find equipment. The cost of that is too much. It's not a responsible use of taxpayer money, all of those sorts of things. The federal government in the budget announced additional spending anyway, and I think there's about $110 or $115 billion in total infrastructure spending over the next 10 years indicated in the budget.
Yeah, 120.
120. What we have, though, in the backdrop, so this budget must be looked at in the backdrop or against the backdrop, not just of a pending election, but also of climate change. And when you look at spending on infrastructure, we're talking about spending on concrete, steel, trucks, heavy equipment, and all of those things have a carbon footprint to them. So if we're going to spend money on infrastructure, then we should take the opportunity to address that carbon emission footprint, look at the embodied carbon in our infrastructure projects, and go, how do we use that significant spending? $120 billion sounds like a lot of money because it is. If we're going to spend that kind of money, can we use that investment to kickstart local initiatives in things like low emission steel, low emission concrete? Can we shift our construction industry from diesel powered heavy machinery to electric vehicles, like battery powered electric vehicles, to hydrogen, like any of that kind of stuff? Can even a small portion of that $120 billion be dedicated? Can we put in place incentives to shift to lower emission technologies and lower emission methods and materials in the construction industry? Can we push for reductions targets in the way in which, in the levels of embodied carbon in our infrastructure projects? And there is not a single thing over the next decade that would help improve that bottom line in terms of the carbon emissions that come from that massive infrastructure spend. Nothing at all. Just such a wasted opportunity.
And also, speaking of wasted opportunities, on top of all of that, only a tiny fraction of these projects that the government has sort of put forward for infrastructure spending are actually on the Infrastructure Australia, this is good for the country list of infrastructure projects that 40%? Need to be done. Yeah, I think it's even less than that. It's small. And this is what gets me, is a lot of these projects are not what previous sort of politicians have called shovel ready. These things are not going to get started for possibly a decade, but we're throwing money at them now because it looks great on paper.
What as well is happening in this investment in infrastructure? I'm not going to pretend I know every single investment of infrastructure, but these kind of primary ones that they're looking at the moment. So we've got kind of the Melbourne intermodal terminal package, and then there's a series of kind of faster rails, and then actually for yourself, Elana, you're getting MetroNet, which is, I suppose, would be very exciting for Western Australia. That's actually very exciting. But to me, when I'm looking through a lot of these, majority of them are, yes, you need them, improvements on already existing things, but what they don't actually set up, other than potentially MetroNet, is actually this kind of expansion of our rail network. There is a little bit around more dams and irrigation, expanding it up in Queensland, I believe. But majority of these aren't actually an expansion. They're an improvement, but they're not an expansion. So what that means is we still have these very centralized things that we've already had issues with. We're not actually giving increased opportunities to reduce rail, to reduce road transport or anything like that. We are still relying very heavily, and even in these rail systems, we aren't moving to greener or more energy effective kind of solutions. And so exactly what you're saying, Steve, but it is so clear that in these what we have or what the government has chosen to invest in this infrastructure pipeline for the next 10 years, it's still not forward thinking, it's still not growth driving, and it's still not we've got massive amounts of development, even I know out into my kind of way to this new Sydney airport at Badgerys Creek, and we're still not even seeing that sort of stuff coming through.
We're not seeing improvements in making our cities more walkable. We're not seeing improvements in making our cities more rideable. We're not seeing investments that would encourage people to use electric bicycles, electric scooters, electric motorbikes even, all of those things that would actually improve the livability of our cities, improve the air quality of our cities, allow for greater tree cover in our cities, because you don't need to worry so much about clearing the tree canopy to allow cars and things to go through. Like, all of that stuff has been forgotten. Like, none of it is in here.
Also, focusing on that city area, beyond even the climate benefit, in terms of our climate action response, even beyond that, in terms of trying to get people back into cities, there's a state element to this as well. I know in Sydney, there's all these grants that keep getting given out at random intervals to get you back into the city and invest and spending at restaurants, and it ends up getting spent at KFC and Red Rooster and all those places that need investment. But what would actually happen if we made cities more accessible is that we would actually have that natural recovery. I know going into the city now, like for me to actually go in, one, it's a 2-hour train trip at the moment because we've had so many shutdowns and everything. It's a 2-hour train trip, and most of them actually shut down at 10 p.m. or that you can't actually get anything. I don't want to go into the city. I don't really want to go outside of my local area because it is not accessible by safe walking areas, by public transport, and then you look at the environmental impacts of that.
Yeah. Again, I say the way in which we're choosing to invest our money is not forward thinking. So we would have had the opportunity to say, let's invest in regional infrastructure so that we can take pressure off our urban centres and encourage people to relocate into regional communities and take their work with them. So if we've learnt nothing from the last 2 years, we've at least learned the fact that a lot of white-collar work can be done very effectively remotely, that a lot of office work can be remote work, and that a job in the city doesn't need to be there. We've absolutely demonstrated that the connection between work and the workplace for a lot of industries can and should be broken, and that those workers can and would love to relocate into regional areas. Now, there are issues associated with that, but if we were to invest in telecommunications infrastructure across regional and rural Australia, that would actually encourage people to take those white-collar jobs into those rural communities. It takes their salary and their spending capability into those regional communities. If you talk about, what are we going to do to transition away from fossil fuels? Well, in a lot of communities that are dependent on fossil fuel mining and extraction, the ability to actually have those white-collar workers part of the local community and spending money there instead of being reliant on those mining jobs, that would be a way to help that transition.
There was a small bit put towards that. There was 1.3 billion put towards telecommunications over the next 6 years.
Yeah, that's peanuts.
Just to remind us, though, that is in
year.
comparison to $120 billion in our infrastructure package.
It's
we are
peanuts.
getting like literally 1% into. Yep. Yes, 1%. I'm making sure my math is right. I'm not a math student. But that our telecommunications is 1% of that infrastructure development. What happens if we just put 2% in, where instead of 8,000 kilometres of regional transport routes, so primarily we're talking about I would be assuming that's a lot of our, again, reinforcing in roads, basically. If that's our regional transport routes, we're not talking about the trains. But once again, we're talking about such a minimal amount of what we're sitting here going, surely that would just be practical.
$200 million a year is less than what a company like Qantas spends on IT in a year.
And there is another 480 million to improve NBN infrastructure, which I don't have a time frame for that one.
Again,
you know.
and again,
though,
that's peanuts.
we're talking about under $2 billion is their total investment in the digital economy.
It should be possible in a country like Australia to drive between any regional town or any regional centre and receive coverage. It should be possible. And it's not, and it's a
driving from my house
joke.
to uni. From my house to uni, I can't get service, and I'm 30 minutes from one of the largest city centres.
I was out driving, and this was years ago, on a project for the bank I was working for at the time, and we were driving out in the country near Geraldton, and we're driving past a wind farm. The irony was we were in a, being that far rural, we had no coverage. But all of a sudden we started getting text messages and things coming through on our phones because it was bouncing off the wind turbines. We were getting the signal that way. So more wind, people. But I want to bring it back to, you mentioned MetroNet, which, as completely agree, great project. I just want to point out that project was initiated and originally funded by state government. It is underway at the moment. Supreme Leader for Life, Mark McGowan, announced just yesterday that the first test train had run through the Armidale to Forestfield link, part of the train package that they were building. And this is part of our infrastructure to actually have a train out to the Perth airport. So for anybody living outside of WA, I realise it's all meaningless, but for WA people, it's quite a significant achievement. All the federal government has done is come along and gone, here's some extra money for MetroNet. Yay. And go us, yeah. And of course, Mark McGowan, being very savvy political operator that he is, isn't going to turn around and go, no, we're fine, we don't need federal funding. He obviously will take it, but it's not brand new nation building infrastructure. He's literally just shoveling more money against stuff that was going to get built regardless.
Yeah.
Again, I just get frustrated because this coalition government from Abbott through to Morrison have all been about, we are the infrastructure government, except they're not. Except every single budget, they're either spending less money than they claim, or, they're fudging it so that it looks like a huge amount of money, but it's spread over 10 years, and realistically anything longer than the forward estimates, which is 4 years, is just a boondoggle. It's never going to end up anywhere. And then they're going ahead and spending it on the wrong shit,
Yeah. And look, I want to come back to something Rhiannon mentioned earlier, speaking about spending money on the wrong shit. We do have an investment on dams and water infrastructure, which everybody other than Barnaby Joyce acknowledges won't do anything useful. So I think there is about $2 billion in water infrastructure spend. It includes some dams in central Queensland. Absolutely nobody other than Barnaby Joyce, and I mean that from the irrigators themselves, the people who might build the dams, all the way through to the Water Authority, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, the local traditional owners of the land on which the dams will be built. Everybody agrees that it's a bad idea, that won't provide any material benefit and will actively do damage. Barnaby Joyce's response to that when he was posed these questions were, I don't care.
Barnaby, allegedly the country's greatest retail politician.
We need a segment on Barnaby.
We do.
For kicks, but
yeah. We should dedicate a whole episode to Barnaby. I feel like since his return to the Nationals leadership, which again is an episode unto itself, it's like it's not so much that he's given up, but he's given up pretending. The naked grab for money to not just feather his own nest, which is one aspect, but simply to shower money on the electorates for Nationals MPs. And it's not even a cynical vote-buying exercise. It is literally just a vote-buying exercise. It's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, the Nationals, commentators have been saying for years that the Nationals are not a political party. They're just a group of grifters out for themselves. And since Barnaby has returned to the Nationals leadership, it's literally, they're not just saying the quiet part out loud, they're doing the quiet part out loud.
Much more overt.
Yeah. It's, anyway, Shall we talk about climate change?
I was just about to say, so look, like we said before, the bit of the elephant in the room, but it's not really. It's like an elephant-shaped hole that's in this budget. So obviously last year, November last year, was the COP26,
Oh, yes.
COP26,
Gosh, that
where,
feels like, I was going to say,
oh,
that
it
feels
feels
like that happened
eons
3
ago,
years ago. Like,
eons ago, I know. But, that did happen only last year, and this was kind of the first budget post that. And there was some anticipation around that we would see something that actually reflected a commitment to that. I don't know why we did. That was it's probably ignorant on everybody else's behalf. But
we
there
live in
was
hope.
we do. We live in hope. Yeah, there was the hope that we would see a lot more green investment. It's just not there. It's just not there. I don't know
Oh,
how else to describe it. It isn't there. The small amounts of the tiny amounts on and kind like environmental investment, minusculely so, especially in comparison to a lot of what we've seen. And the other big gap that is in it is actually even in terms of the future predictions that we've got of kind of future economic predictions in which we do consider potential outbreaks within China, do consider what's happening with the Russia and Ukraine at the moment, and we don't talk about climate change. We don't talk about the economic impacts of climate change. It does mention the floods and the economic impacts of the floods, but no economic impacts of climate change. And I cannot understand what has happened in that for it to just not. It's barely spoken about really. Or they put the 1 billion over 9 years towards Great Barrier Reef protection. There's another 60 million, which now we've been talking in hundreds of billions, and they've got 60 million towards recycling tops and 630 million to 1,000 new rangers. It's infuriating, it's disappointing, it's upsetting to just see it as this such enormous oversight. And already the Liberal government has the lowest emissions reduction target of any of Australia's major political parties. They're already sitting below where we would hope they would be. But when their government has made a commitment to those targets to not even put in place anything for change in the hope of some sort of technological future, which they still have minusculely invested in, it doesn't make sense. And the gap is so large that there's actually not even much to say about it.
no, you're right. And eons ago, when COP26 happened and Morrison turned up to it with an actual commitment to net zero by 2050, and everyone sat back and went, what price did Barnaby extract for the national sort of grudging acceptance of that particular reality? Well, that chicken has come home to roost with a thud in this budget, because the answer was about $20 billion in useless regional investment that's going to do nothing but be used by Barnaby to try and convince people to re-elect him and his cronies. I mean, we're back to talking about the dams and all this other stuff that is not only not going to be effective, but is going to end up being actively opposed by the people on the ground who are going to be affected by those things. And the fact that the government has actually put $1 billion toward protecting the reef is kind of this grudging acceptance that the reef is actually in danger, which is probably the first hint that they've actually acknowledged that. But it's, they have this whole technology, not taxes thing on addressing climate change, yet they're not funding any of the technology research and exploration to actually achieve what they claim will happen with technology, not taxes. Never mind actually doing anything concrete about addressing climate change. And they're actually increasing their investment in fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Let's just touch on some of that for a moment. So, we're spending $100 million a year for the next 9 years, or $112 million a year for the next 9 years to protect the Great Barrier Reef. The Great Barrier Reef is estimated as an asset. So this is the budget. So we're going to think about things in economic terms. The Great Barrier Reef is viewed as an asset with a value of about $56 billion. So Deloitte Access Economics estimates the value of the Great Barrier Reef as an asset to the country about $56 billion. 64,000 people are directly employed as a result of the Great Barrier Reef, and it contributes $6.5 billion per year to the Australian economy. It is in significant trouble. We had a sixth mass bleaching event just recently, and virtually no part of the Great Barrier Reef was untouched by that bleaching event. So we've got a large driver of regional jobs, regional tourism, regional economic benefit right up and down the east coast of Queensland that comes from the Great Barrier Reef. It is an important environmental asset for the planet, let alone just Australia, beyond its economic value. It is in distress, and that distress has been caused by climate change and global warming. And our government has committed $100 million a year to help protect it. That's an insult, in addition to being grossly ignorant of the scale of the problem. It is an insult to every Australian that that's the kind of money that we would put towards protecting it. We spend more on protecting man-made assets than we are talking. It is such an insulting amount to spend that there. But it's not even the end of the story. It's just like one little piece that you pull out of it. But it's indicative time and time and time again of the way in which this government over the last 9 years has responded to problems, which is to do as little as possible in order to say, look at what we're doing, and then tally it up over the longest period of time that they can get away with to make it sound like a big number, pat themselves on the back for it, take a photo op, have a press announcement, and then ignore it into the future. Like that's no way to govern. And it really is frustrating, but it's also distressing.
Yeah. One of the things that has emerged from the budget, and it's not related directly to the budget, but it is this speculation that the government is actually choosing to govern badly. Like it's a deliberate choice on their part. And I'll unpack it a bit.
Yeah.
Because I mean, people like you and I, people far more better educated and better qualified than the three of us, have been saying for some time now, how is it possible that they're this incompetent? Because you literally couldn't be this incompetent if you tried, kind of thing. And that sort of opens up the question of, well, are they trying to be this incompetent? And there is actually a theory emerging now where they are actually trying to be this incompetent, that they are deliberately destroying the trust in government as not just a provider of services, but as the thing that, what's the word? As the institution that is supposed to make life better for its citizens.
Yeah. And
we saw this with the George W. Bush administration in the US. We've seen it with the Trump administration. There's actually an amazing thread on Twitter, which I'll link to in the show notes, that actually laid it out in really startling detail of things that are now endemic in the US, where the people who can afford to pay for private firefighting brigades, pay for private police, private security. They're doing all of that because the actual government-funded services are no longer functioning. And we saw a hint of it with the floods in Lismore, where the residents of Lismore and other areas of New South Wales actually just gave up on expecting any help from the authorities. If the people of Lismore had sat back and waited for the authorities to come and help them, thousands of people would have died in those floods.
Yes.
But they didn't, because the people of Lismore just took care of it themselves.
Yeah.
And there is a theory that that's what the government is basically working toward, is that this fraying trust in the ability of government to actually deliver for its people. And once that trust goes, then democracy becomes a kleptocracy where the people who can afford to run for office run for office. And then when they're in office, all of their efforts are directed at funneling funds to their donors and to the people, to the corporations and the billionaires who own the government.
Yeah.
And anyone who has the slightest interest in American politics looks at America and goes, like, you can already see it. It's quite possible that American democracy is in its death throes at the moment because it's too far gone. But we're starting to see that emerge in Australia, and that's terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, there's a notion that our public service should deliver a level and a quality and a breadth of service that's commensurate with our belief in what the minimum living standard should look like in Australia. and that should be the way that we approach it. I think Richard Dennis's recent book, Big, The Role of Government in Australian Society, I think is the full title, but Big sort of asks that question and poses that question, which is what should the size and shape in particular of our public service look like? But I think if we just think about it in terms of our public sector and our public service should ensure the delivery of a standard of living that we want all Australians to enjoy. And that's how we fund and structure our public sector as a minimum thing. You can see the gap that exists between what the public service is able to deliver and what we might want our minimum quality of life to look like for all Australians by looking at the charitable section. Charitable industry in Australia, charities exist to fill the gap essentially between our expectation of what that minimum standard of living should look like and the ability of our public sector to deliver on it. Our public sector is shrinking. It's no surprise that that charitable sector is growing. It's one of the faster growing segments of our economy, go figure. But this notion that it's because of a deliberate program of undermining, widening, reducing not only the actual ability of our public sector to deliver services, not only in a crisis, but always, and a deliberate program of undermining belief and trust in those institutions so that the next round of cuts becomes that much more easy. I think it was David Ritter was the Twitter thread, and I've posted the link in our chat so that it can be shared with our listeners. But it was a very good thread that talks through some of the implications of this and points to some of the signs. He was sort of coaching it in terms of the East Coast floods that have been going on in Queensland and New South Wales over the last 4 or 5 weeks, I guess, and looking at the emergency response. But I also note that Scott Morrison himself stood up at a press conference just recently and made the point quite explicit. People can't rely on and should not rely on government services to be there in an emergency. And I found that an incredibly disappointing point of view for the highest representative of our government in this country, the Prime Minister, to stand there and essentially say, we're not even going to try and do that.
You're on your own. Yeah, as a citizen of the nation that Morrison purports to lead. When he said that, my first thought was, well, literally, what is the point of you then? Like, literally, what is the point of government if not to deliver those crucial services in our hours of need? There's a theme that every billionaire is a policy failure, and it's usually trotted out in the context of we should be taxing rich people in order to fund these vital services that government should be providing. But the flip side to that is every charity is a policy failure as well. Nobody working in the charity sector actually wants that sector to thrive and for them to have long-term career opportunities in that sector. The charity sector is literally working to render itself redundant because in theory, government should be stepping in and providing the services that charities are providing because, as you said, charities are stepping up and providing in the absence of policy, in the absence of those services.
I learnt that in year 11. So it was in my legal studies class. I found that the best way for me to break down why our legal system has failed us is turn to our non-legal responses, basically. And that consistently our non-legal responses will provide the answer for wherever you have gaps. And what also happened particularly I'm thinking about our women's statement from this budget, is that a lot of the way of solving these bigger issues was we'll just chuck some money at a charity. There's for the Illawarra Women's Health Centre, and there's for the McGrath Foundation, and there's for Beyond Blue or Lifeline, and there's the money just chucked at it, as opposed to looking at any broader issue or how does our government actually respond to this? Because that's not your government responding. That is an independent organisation doing that. And what it also does there is it does take away the accountability that they have to have over that. That when that money is then given to an independent organisation that is no longer government run, what happens with that money is no longer actually their responsibility. No, we checked it off. We funded that. We put investment into that. What do you mean that it's not working? Well, that must be the organisation's fault. Not that we were missing broader structural issues or that we weren't actually taking action for ourselves.
coming back to the point about billionaires, I think it's wonderful that billionaires exist. I think it's a great thing that billionaires exist. It is a distinct sign of failure as a society when you have both billionaires and people living in poverty.
Yeah.
That's the sign of failure.
Yeah.
We should not have both of those things. So if you want to have billionaires, then do something to eradicate poverty, homelessness, disadvantage in all its forms, and then knock yourself out with billionaires. Go for it. Go for it. More power to you. But first, you have to address those structural issues, those structural inequalities, the structural disadvantage, the systemic racism, the systemic gender inequalities that exist, that hold down large portions of our society. Deal with those first, and then you can have your billionaires, but not the other way around. And I can guarantee you that the reason you have billionaires is because you're insisting on keeping those structural inequalities in place.
Yes. There's a great tweet that does the rounds every now and then of when people get their first billion, we should issue them a certificate going, congratulations, you've won capitalism. Now we're going to tax 100% of what you earn above that billion to then put that into eradicating poverty. Because
just want to make mention of the fact that at one point in time, there was a tax on the wealthiest. So America had a taxation system. It was progressive. Over a certain amount, income was taxed at 92%. Any dollar that you earned over that amount, 92% of it went to the government, and you got to keep 8% of anything over and above that amount. I don't know where that amount was, but it was high. It was like 0.1% of income earners would have fallen into that bracket, but 92% of their wealth. There were howls when that dropped to only 70% in the 50s. And I think today it's probably down around 30 or 32% in America. And with it has come a decline in just about every measure of disadvantage and inequality in that country.
So just to put a comparison point for Australia, approximately as of 2020, but approximately 14% of our population live below the poverty line. So that's 3.5 million people. Gina Reinhart is worth $15 billion. Please, could we not take just $1 billion away? Would she miss $1 billion? And not her specifically. It's not about that. I'm very supportive of, good on you, Gina. But if we're looking at that very, like you said, that 0.1%, are they going to miss the billion that would actually eradicate that poverty line? In theory, a lot of other considerations around it, but from an economic standpoint and of actually having the value in place there.
And I want to point out the Democrats, as a point of policy, have a tax on wealth for estates over $10 million when they're inherited. So when wealth is transferred, let's call it that, when wealth is transferred, there is a tax of, I think, 2%. I'd have to go and check. It's a small amount. But over the next 10 years, 15 years, something like $2.5 trillion in wealth will be transferred intergenerationally. So as one generation passes away, their money passes on. In that process, all of that is tax-free. It didn't used to be. The removal of an inheritance tax in Australia was triggered by Joh Bjelke-Petersen in the early 80s. They took it away in Queensland to try and encourage retirees to move to Queensland so that they could protect their wealth when they passed away. Every other state subsequently folded and removed their wealth tax as well. As a result, the share of national income that sits with income earners has increased. The share of wealth or the share of taxation that sits with wealth has virtually disappeared. It doesn't have to be that way. It was a design decision that was put in place. It's one that we want to see returned, because otherwise the burden of paying for taxes, the burden for paying for public services sits firmly with workers in a way that today is far out of proportion historically with what we've seen in Australia.
Yeah, and before people start clutching their pearls about this, most of the countries in the OECD have a wealth tax of this nature.
Yeah, they do.
Like Australia is really like a bizarre outlier on this.
Yeah, the threshold that we're talking about is out of the reach of even the wildest dreams of most Australians. We're talking about a few tens of thousands of Australian households have wealth that falls into this kind of bucket, and yet it would deliver a significant shift in how our tax is structured.
Yeah, the pandemic ripped away all the band-aids that had sort of papered over the cracks in terms of inequality and poverty and everything in the country, and sort of revealed quite starkly these structural problems that we need to address as a nation and as a society. We really do need to decide as a society what kind of country we want to be. And do we, at the moment, we're a country where 14% of us live below the poverty line. And for a nation as rich and prosperous and successful as Australia, I don't think that's acceptable. I think that's disgusting. That's an absolute failure as a nation.
Yeah, it's absolutely possible for 0 people in Australia to be living in poverty. It's possible. It's absolutely a policy choice that we have made, or we have allowed to be made on our behalf, that there be a group of Australians, 3 million of us at the moment, who live in poverty. And what that looks like should embarrass every last person in this country. We just should not allow it.
No, and Frydenberg is currently spruiking the fact that the unemployment rate's going to end up with a 3 in front of it, which is the first time in 50 years that that's happened. And look, yes, an amazing achievement. Go us. Frydenberg had nothing to, I need to stress, Frydenberg had nothing to do with that. There's a whole range of factors that have contributed to that. What it doesn't address is the fact that the underemployment rate is still sky high. But, there's probably like 8 to 10% of people who would like more hours and would like to be more, have more gainful employment than they're currently getting. But also it reflects, coming back to the whole policy failure thing, it reflects the fact that as a nation, we kept the unemployment rate above 5% for a really, really long time. And as we've said in previous podcasts, that 5% of the population are doing an incredibly important service to the nation to keep inflation down, right? But it means that
they're a sacrifice.
Exactly, yes. And it means that the keeping it unemployment above 5% for as long as we did meant that there were hundreds of thousands of people who could have been employed, who didn't need to be sacrificed and were. And we really need to look at the irony is, of course, it's down, unemployment's down to 3.75%, but inflation's currently going gangbusters. And again, the great irony of this government throwing money onto the inflation bonfire. And sorry, I'm not an economist, so I'm sort of gathering my thoughts here. The inflation that we're experiencing is driven by global pressures and global events outside of our control. So that's why petrol prices are higher at the moment, because of the war in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. What the government's choosing to do is drive domestic demand through the roof at the same time as we have external demand and external pressures kicking up inflation in the country. Yeah. It means that the Reserve Bank's going to have to bring forward the interest rate rises that they flagged much, much sooner. And once you start raising interest rate, you think the cost of living's bad now, you raise interest rates, that's going to be, and keeping in mind interest rates are still at an absolute record low of 0.1%. Once they start increasing those interest rates to combat inflation, cost of living pressures are going to be super painful.
The other thing, sorry, just on Scott Morrison's response to cost of living, his solution to the housing issues that we currently are seeing, well, we'll help you buy a house if you can't afford rent. Just go buy a house. That's no worries. Yeah. Okay.
I hadn't thought of that.
It was just this bizarre, out of touch. I don't know what the intention, and I think this cost of living rhetoric was this kind of recurring thing, and it's we're going to help the cost of living, we're going to help the cost of living, giving one-off payments to pensioners and people on welfare, and there's an investment for, here's also your payments for people on Oz study or youth payments, awesome. Thank you so much. We're helping the cost of living. We're taking down the petrol prices, cost of living, cost of living, cost of living. I don't feel any more secure. I don't think it's actually
It's a
given
one-off
any
payment. It won't do.
a one-off
No.
payment. You've not answered any security around what is going to happen when the cost of things continues going up and wages don't. And what happened in their predictions was that, and look, those are coming from the Treasury, and so it's not directly, whilst it is governmental, and I do understand they have an influence there is kind of a broader who is providing the predictions. There's a broader kind of that there, but it actually is directly conflicting with the Reserve Bank, where they're going, well, we're actually concerned about whether wages are actually going to go up, and actually we don't see wages going up, and that is where our issue kind of lies. And so what this budget has now done is relied its predictions upon something that I don't know if it's actually going to be an accurate representation. I suppose that's the power of predictions. But
The budget for the last 9 years has consistently forecast wages growth above what has actually occurred and above levels that had previously been in play. So every single budget that the coalition has delivered in this government over the last 9 years, wages have been low. They've predicted to increase. And the reality subsequently has been that wages have stayed low. And the following year, they've predicted that wages are going to be high again. Similarly, they've predicted rates of GDP growth that haven't eventuated, and they've predicted levels of inflation that haven't eventuated. This one is no different. They're exactly the same things in there. What's important is that those predictions are being used to justify the stage 3 tax cuts coming through and some of the other spending measures. So we don't need to rein back on spending this year because next year GDP growth is going to increase and wages are going to increase. So not only will we have more money in the economy, you'll have more money in your pocket, and therefore we don't have to worry about actually cutting back on expenditure, and we don't have to worry about doing things that might change our position on tax cuts. It's a fantasy, and they do it every single year.
And I think the juxtaposition of giving pensioners and people on social security payments a one-off $250 payment to help with the cost of living, when we have legislated tax cuts for high-income earners that will return over $9,000 a year to the highest income earners in the country.
Costs $15 billion a year to begin.
Yeah. We could spend $15 billion on lifting people out of poverty.
During the pandemic, when we were looking at the increase in the job seeker rate and the age pension rate and the disability pension rate, there was an estimate that was made that to increase each of those, so take all of those people and increase them up to the Henderson poverty line, which instead of $43.57 a day is about $88 a day at the moment. So effectively doubling their payments, and which was done during the pandemic as an economic stimulus measure. To make that permanent would cost the budget about $12 to $13 billion a year. If we took the money that we're giving to the highest income earners, 2/3 of which are men, and instead we paid it to those benefit recipients, not only could we do that, but we would have change. We would have a few $1 billion left over. We would effectively lift 700,000 to 1 million Australians to the poverty line, so take them out of poverty in one fell swoop. We would not give money, $9,000 a year. We would not give that money to high income earners, and we'd have change. That type of grand gesture, that idea of we're going to do something significant with our money rather than pay it off to donors and voters is completely lacking. But there, once again, is that sense of a wasted opportunity, a lack of vision, a lack of clarity around the type of country that we want to be living in, as evidenced by where we choose to spend our money.
And I think a really important point is that 2/3 of high income earners are men. Probably 2/3 of the people living in poverty and who are on social security, I refuse to call it welfare because it's not. It's social security, are women. There's a brilliant podcast out recently from the Policy Forum pod on women and social security, and how misogynistic and sort of almost designed to keep them in poverty and keep them disadvantaged. It is. And again, that's a discussion for another time. But I'll put a link to the show notes in that if people want to go listen to that. It comes back to, again, how this government sees the role of women and sees the role of caring in society and how they value it, or more to the point, how they don't value it. And that $12 or $13 billion that we could invest in lifting people out of poverty would be one of the greatest economic drivers that this country has seen for decades. And instead, we're looking at investing $15 billion in giving high-income earners, who are mostly men, a tax cut, which they will then not spend. They will save, they will put into their superannuation, they'll do whatever.
Yeah, or spending it on infrastructure that probably won't get built, or spending it on dams that won't deliver any benefit. The lowest income earners by percentile, it's about a 60-40 split women to men. Parity is around, where is it? Parity kicks in around the 45th percentile.
Wow.
So it's only when you get there that you start to see parity in terms of that income band between men and women. And then from then on in, it shifts towards men to the point where in the highest income band, 99th percentile, 100th percentile, it's actually closer to 3 to 1 men to women. In the highest income bracket, 82%. Out of 110,000 income earners in the top tax bracket, which is $350,000 a year and above, 82,000 are men, 28,000 are women.
Bloody hell. It's really stark, isn't it?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, on that happy note...
In summary, let me just say this was a blatant attempt to buy votes. It was a blatant attempt to not annoy anybody in particular. It is riddled with not enough to have an impact, but just enough to be able to say we're doing something. It is full of distortions in terms of the amount of money that is being spent by packaging things up over a much longer period of time to be able to announce a large pot of money. In some cases, those announcements include amounts of money that don't appear until after the forward estimates. So there's almost no money being spent during the next period of government, and it's only miraculously at some point beyond the next administration that we start to see money for these things. We're not addressing any structural issues. We're not addressing structural issues with the age pension. We're not addressing structural issues with superannuation. We're not addressing the minimum wage. We're not addressing social benefits. We're not addressing the pay equity and gender gap in our economy. We're not addressing the fact that most unpaid work and most care work is both undervalued and delivered by women. Like, none of that is being addressed. We're not addressing climate change. It's a waste. It's a $650 billion waste in an attempt to stay in power to achieve 3 more years of not very much.
Yeah. The redoubtable Ross Gittins said that budgets are inherently political because obviously they're delivered by politicians, and economists accept that when they look at budgets. But the reality is, even though budgets are political documents, they do impact the nation's finances and they impact the nation as a whole. And this is the most political of budgets that I think most economists have seen for a really, really long time. And that kind of says everything, doesn't it?
This is only my second budget since being a legal voter. Do you leave every year disappointed? Is that the nature of it?
Pretty much, yeah.
I don't. I certainly have been disappointed over the last 9 years. I think this coalition government has characterised its budgets by a small-mindedness, a pettiness, a meanness. It demonstrates a dislike for the elderly, a dislike for the unemployed, a dislike for students, a dislike for the infirm, anyone with a disability. It doesn't seem to like. There's a lot of people in the population that it expresses its dislike for by the way in which it funds various programs. And you can see it year on year on year. Joe Hockey in his first budget was awfully mean-spirited in the way in which funding was allocated, and it really hasn't changed all that much since. It hasn't always been that way. There definitely have been times when you look at the budget, you look at where money has been spent, the federal government response during the GFC was a much more productive and optimistic use of far less money. It left a legacy across our schools, right? Like nationwide, a lot of the school halls that you see existing in public schools around the country are a result of that kind of nation building expenditure. It was an investment in something that would have quite tangible, long lasting benefits right across the public school system in Australia. We just haven't seen that kind of thing over the last 9 years. And it comes with a great sense of not only disappointment, but a lost opportunity. And we will look back on this 9-year period as a period of real loss for the country, not only in terms of going backwards in so many measures right across the economy, right across society. We seem to be going backwards relative to other countries, but also as a lost opportunity of where we spend our money, how we invested it, and the waste that has come from that.
So, well, hopefully next year's budget...
We won't have to wait until next year.
You're right.
I don't think we'll have to wait for next year. So Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese have both said a Labor government will deliver a new budget. We're not going to get stuck with this one. We'll legislate the flash of money because people could do with it. Absolutely. You've mismanaged things so badly. People do need that relief. But when it comes to how that money is going to be spent on those big ticket items, how much we invest in a variety of different things, we're going to scrap this and redo it.
Right. Okay. So budget nerds, you need to live in hope that we get a Labor government.
We'll be back in June with a Labor version of this podcast, and we'll see, Rhiannon, whether or not budgets are necessarily disappointing or whether they can in fact be an inspiring look at what our nation might become.
And if all goes well, that some familiar faces might be even closer to the action.
I hope to be very, very closely involved in the next budget cycle, although I will say the budget is likely to be delivered in June. And even if we're successful at the next election, we won't take our seats in the Senate until the 1st of July. So we may miss out on the fun, but if that's the case, guaranteed we'll be here.
We will have more news on all of that very, very soon. As I said at the end of the last podcast, we'll have some new Democrats' voices for people to listen to very, very shortly. We're looking forward to introducing all of our candidates to our listeners very, very, very soon as in the lead up to the elections. So much to look forward to. So thank you guys so much for coming along, sticking your budget nerd hat on, doing yet another autopsy. And if we're lucky, we'll get to do another one in a few months' time. It's going to be great. More stuff to look forward to.
Thank you both.
Thank you, guys.
My thanks as always to Rhiannon and Steve for their insights, and hopefully the next budget will be less disappointing for young people. It was only in editing that I realised we hadn't touched on the fact that there was no money in the budget for a federal ICAC, which, let's face it, is not surprising. But it's still an egregious election promise not kept. The government would probably argue that they put no money in the budget for an integrity commission because Labor wouldn't support it. And then Labor would point out that they don't support the government's proposed integrity commission because it seems designed to hide corruption, not investigate it, and around we go. The other area that saw no love in the budget was, unsurprisingly, the arts. After 2 years of pandemic-induced catastrophe for live performances, the government has slashed funding for arts and cultural development from $159 million down to $20 million, demonstrating their absolute contempt for an industry still recovering from the loss of audiences and income over the last 2 years. I've put links to Big, the new book by Richard Dennis that Steve referred to, in the show notes, as well as links to all our campaign platforms, so you can see what we would fight for if we were in the Parliament when the next budget is handed down. If you want to help us return to Parliament in the imminent federal election, apart from voting for us in the Senate, you can donate to our election campaign. We do not receive taxpayer funding, and we have no large corporate donors. All of our funding is from our members and supporters, so every dollar will count to help us return to Parliament and keep the bastards honest. Keep the Bastards Honest is brought to you by the Australian Democrats. This episode was edited and produced by me, Elana Mitchell. If you'd like to keep in touch, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and LinkedIn by searching for Australian Democrats. And you can see what we stand for, what we value, and what our policy positions are at our website at democrats.org.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.